About 2 weeks ago, Molly and I got the chance to join a few other Star Wars podcasters at Lucasfilm, which was amazing. We're going to do a vlog about the whole trip, but part of it was the opportunity to chat with Margit Pfeiffer, the supervising sound editor for Andor. She was awesome and taught us a lot, and it just reminded me about the hard work that goes into every detail of a Star Wars story. I hope you enjoy the chat.
Margit, do you want to just start off by introducing yourself and also what you did on Andor Season 2?
Okay, well, my name is Margit Pfeiffer. I am the supervising sound editor, and I'm in charge of all the dialogue, ADR, and loop group on the series. So all the human elements you hear, any actors and voices and cast and production dialogue be cleaned up, but also the large chants and crowds for the Gorman scenes, the fictional language. So any human spoken element for or background is what I view.
Andor. Human android, correct? Did you also work with Alan Tudyk?
I did. I worked with Alan and B2.
Yes. Oh, yes. Molly, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I will. So what was the process like for creating a soundscape for a brand new planet that you had never seen in live action before, like Chandrila or Foreman? Specifically because in season 1, planets like Ferrix, it was a lot of like gravelly, rusty sound effects, but Chandrila is such a like high class planet compared to that. So what was that process?
So for Chandrila, we're mostly at the wedding, and it was very a high society wedding. So it's very elegant and some steeped in historical traditions and all. And then for Gorman, there was an entire fictional language developed. And that really identifies it as a new place that we had never seen or especially heard before. And we went all out. Tony wanted French actors to play the Gorman scenes. And so a fictional language called Gore was developed based on French phonetics. And compared to, the actors practiced in it and had lines written and translated. And Marina Tyndall, who was Diego's dialect coach on Rogue One, had developed the language, the Conlang, came up with it. And then we shot within it, and the loop group and everything for it. And Tony wrote lines and stage directions, and we shot it with the voice actors and sunk it up and tried to make it, first peaceful and then panicky and gory. But that is a fictional language, so that really identifies it.
Based off of that, with specifically episode 8 of season 2 with the Gorman episode,
Yeah.
I feel like that had to be like a challenging scene and episode to do sound on, because there's so much going on with the gore, the chanting, the horns, all of it, the TIE fighters flying over. Can you talk a little bit about that episode specifically?
Yeah. So 208 is really the climax of the full bore planet scenes that started in 205. And you want to have in this very long sequence, you need to be careful to build it. You can't start full throttle, all loud and going on the entire time. You had the chants, we had the protests, we had the singing, we had the battle, we had the panic screams, as you said, the TIE fighters, the weapons, the explosions. And it's sort of a dance along with the music. So you want to set up the different locations on the plaza and say, here we are here. Then it's the location where they find out, the plaza is locked, that they're locked in, and the panic starts to spread. And then for certain picture cuts, you want to punch the cuts. You want to come on really hard on death yells or death grunts, and then the angry crowd screaming at them. And then you cut to the interior, and you hear the backdrop on the outside. And then you build, and it's a trade-off. There's elements where you want sound design to lead and sound effects. And then you want the human element, the panic. You want to feel it building with the panic cries at the end and the drama. And the music has to carry the emotion all the way throughout. And it's sort of, you weave in and out. You give yourself peaks and valleys to go to. And that's how you get the energy to rise all the way to the end.
You think like on a smaller scale, I wanted to kind of shift from the Gorman massacre, right? And talk about something that it's also very, I think, emblematic of Andor, both season 1 and season 2, which are speeches, right? Like everyone talks about all the speeches in Andor, and Andor season 2 is, takes it up a notch on all the ones that we've seen so far. And so I wanted to ask about that because they're so vocally driven, performance driven, but they're all wildly different. We have Saw's speech about Waitonium, and we have Bell's lament about Cinta, and obviously Mon Mothma's, grand speech in the Senate. So my question about that is like, how do you approach each one individually to give it its own character so that each one has gravitas because each one has such a different emotion to it. So like what's your process in designing the sounds for all these different speeches, and which one maybe stood out to you as your favorite?
Out of all the ones you mentioned, I'm going to start off with Mon Mothma's speech, which is obviously is her performance mainly is the wonderful thing that drives it, and the emotion she has in her voice. But then it goes with the juxtaposition of the crowd getting angrier and angrier, and the shouts in between, and as it fills, and she runs off, and as she walks out into the hallway, there's the booing, and you hear the energy. And so through just having something opposing her, you get a stronger effect. And the Rhydonium speech for Saw, have the little dials and the things in the background and the breathing and the oxygen masks and like you have the rain and the thunder. And so for him, you want to build in intensity and have it harder and harder to push and cut through. And it's a very different, energy than you would have in Mon Mothma's speech. And for Belle, mourning the loss of Singta, it's just her raw emotion, but her not being on the cusp of breaking. And a few little moments, you feel her quiver, and then she carries on. And there's the three totally different types of speeches.
Kind of going off what Gus is saying, I love in the Mon Mothma speech how as the Senate listens to it, we also listen to it, but from many different points of view, in the lobby or Mon's driver or Cassian in the hallway. And each one sounds a little different as her speech built. Were there any challenges in doing all those different areas where it's coming through and keeping everything going and building to a momentum, like you were saying?
So we needed the entire speech for the context of it all. So all the dialogue really matters, and to keep it going, we would add different types of locations and reverbs on backgrounds depending on where we were, whether we're in the driver's car or in the hallway or in the little cafe area, the lounge. And you accomplish that with tweaking the FUTs a tiny little bit. You don't want to go too far that it sounds really surreal, but you want to fit it in the room. And so it could keep going the entire time. And then once you're clear on her again, you have that wonderful effect of having more intimacy again by being right there.
You've talked about building intensity using the sound design, but I'm actually curious about one of the most terrifying things in Andor is something we don't hear.
Yeah.
It's Dr. Gore's torture method. So how did you go about using sound and building to that moment to make that such a chilling thing where it's just like, we don't know what it is, but it's still very effective?
Yeah. Tony early on, so we talked about it, Tony Gilroy and everybody, we were debating, should we give this a real sound and what could it be and how could it, are we giving something away by making it one thing, but the fantasy of everybody what it could be is almost more effective. To stay in the room and feel the torture, we were very much on whoever he tortures in the scenario with Bix, or then the other way around, on really focusing on the breaths and efforts and the panic and terror. And in the room, you'd have some little tiny background noise, but it's just a very little subtle thing, and it's frightening. So the absence of the actual sound, it's scary in the end. Scarier in the end of it, I would.
Yeah, we rewatched the scene from season 1 where Bix is getting tortured, and we hear all of her breathing and her scream at the end, but without any of that from Dr. Borst in season 2. It's a very different feel for the scene.
It's creepier.
And I want to build up on top of that, because one of the things that's interesting about music is not about really the notes, it's about the spaces in between and the silence that carries a lot of things. So, we're always talking about all the sounds in the Gorman Massacre or the performances, but like I was just pointing out, silence sometimes is a more powerful use of the absence of sound in terms of creating a soundscape. So how important, besides Dr. Borst's and the silence of that scene, but how was silence a tool that you used in terms of like your sound design to create more impactful moments?
It's all the way throughout. Because you don't want to clutter the soundtrack, especially if we go back to the Gorman scene. If you had the chanting and screaming going on for 10 minutes nonstop, your ears would be tired and would take you out of the scene. It would be boring. So you want to punch cuts. You want to have quiet moments. Now, in a massacre, you're going to have to go loud. You're going to have to pick and choose. But it's almost like layers, and you decide what to focus on. Or in different scenes, even the very opening in 201 with the TIE Fighter escape, There was a big debate. Do we play it dry? Do we have music? Where do we have music? What do we hear? So we cut on him inside, and you have a little, the little vocalizations of him, and then you're on the outside, and you have the whole sound design of the spaceship flying through, of the TIE fighter. And then, do you want the music to lead, or do you want the music to, where do you want the treat the handoff? Where do you want to be on sound design? Where do you want it quiet? Where do you want to go? The silence right before it falls off the cliff. You got to get that moment, because then you can go high towards the end. And if you are always full on, it doesn't work. Like when you present the tracks and you work on them, you have everything available. And then in the mix, you decide, we do a pre-mix with David Acord, our wonderful sound supervisor, sound designer, and re-recording mixer. And then it's the picture editor and producer John Gilroy in the room, and they're doing a first thorough pass of what do we feature. And then with Tony in the room and Sunny, our producer, that's when we really decide, where can we tweak, and where can we make it more intense? And Tony also often had these notes on the dialogue for certain scenes to get more he wanted people to lean in. So he said, play it just a little quieter, let them reach for it, to hear it and pay attention. And it's very effective. And we use that tool a lot, intentionally going low with a few things.
You mentioned the TIE fighter at the beginning. This is more about sound design than dialogue, but that was a brand new model that we had never seen before in live action. What was it like creating new or different sounds for a ship that fans are so used to hearing, and it's such a recognizable sound?
So you stay true to the original signature. So previous TIE fighters we had heard, I think what I heard Dave say in an interview was based on an elephant roar. And then you want to embellish it. Of course, everybody wants to leave their touch on it. And a lot of it is given by the environment. You need the sound that cuts. Depending on the action as the plane performs, the fighter jet performs, you need certain tones that cut through the music. But you want to make it, interesting. You want to make it sharp, and I think that's a designer's total dream to touch something like that. And in the context of previous Star Wars sound design, which is iconic, you want to stay true to it, but embellish it.
So, we've been talking about how sound in Andor can really carry the emotional weight of the show. What's one small sound detail in season 2 that you're really proud of, but some people might not even really notice?
Okay. Interesting question, because there are little moments when you take away all the action, and we're gonna go in the apartment with Cyril and Dedra meeting Edie, Cyril's mom, for the first time. And the silence in there makes it even more awkward. And then her, maneuvering the things on the table, grabbing the food, and it dripping down. It just turns the whole thing into, it's comical, and she's doing it I feel like she's doing this intentionally to get to Cyril, and it's very effective. And so that's a fun moment. We had them in season 1, a few things where he slid the spider across the table, or the little cereal falling in the bowl. And, it's just a hypervigilance of what is going on in his world, how he is distracted by that moment, or his tension. And the tension is felt by the absence of a lot of sound.
Yeah.
One of my favorite small details in sound is the Luke and Clea's spy radio network. And the layers of voices as they go through, and the ISB has their own. It's even with Cassian in the ship. What went into creating the spy network, the fractal
radio? Yeah. So I think it's the opening of 205. Clea is working, and we hear all these little transmissions. And this came together already in the cutting room, as they're cutting and they're trying to find the right direction. And so John Gilroy placed his own voice as temps in there. And also a few little clips used that we ended up replacing with voice actors, and Tony Gilroy's voice is in there for a line too. Nice. And the new sound design around it, you want to have the switching sounds, and you want to make it a sonic tapestry that is worthy of opening an episode and gives you an idea of that very essential element with which Clea communicates through the entire seasons all the way to the end.
Did you have your voice in any of it?
I usually tried not to. Self-analyze, I believe, but leave it to the pros. We have a wonderful, amazing loop troupe from Skywalker Sound. And they're all, they're professional actors and sound supervisors. They're just wonderful and perfect. So they're the ones to do that.
Yes, and it's a lot of collaboration, right? It's not like an old department is siloed right, from the other. So I think one of the very fascinating things to me is like how all these pieces come together. I'm very fascinated by that, and one of the things that is, it's not just ADR and it's not just sound design, but it's also the score. So one of the things that I'm very curious about is like how does that collaboration happen between you and Brandon Roberts, and like how to mix the score in a way that one you're appreciating that, but it doesn't override or compete with the sound design in any way.
Yeah. I mean, most of the credit really goes to Tony and John Gilroy in the cutting room while they're working on all these episodes. For scoring, we use still temp tracks until we get the final recordings and the final mixes, and then work them in. But there's placeholders, and you really see you think about what you want the scene to be carried by. So the fractal radio is all about the voices and the design, and then later elements. Obviously, you need the music to bring the emotion and let it fly. And this is decided very early on. And in the final mix, you have nuances. You'll sometimes try and say, can we try this without music? But a lot of thought has been given to where there should be music anyway. And between sound design and dialogue, we would play the ball back and forth. Some scenes, like the speeches and all, it's about every word, every syllable, every little nuance, the intonations, the languages. And then you have sound designing moments where, you just want to feel the magic of Star Wars. Really, you want to hear the creatures, the aliens, the different, like even the battles and the gunfights, and, but also the punches. The hard effects punches and designy punches in the Cyril and Cassian fist fight and the bone cracks, So in that moment, that's what you want.
It's a lot more visceral scene for it.
That's very noticeable. Sounds of the punches down a lot louder, and it hurts. Makes difference.
I think something that makes Andor stand out from other Star Wars shows is that so much of the score, some of it is diegetic, and we're hearing the Donnie singing during the Eye and the heist and everything, or the Ferrex marching band and Narrow. There's a lot of chanting and a lot of singing in the universe. So what was it like to put so much music into Star Wars that like the characters are also hearing it? Almost also.
We almost did our dance hit. So as a comparison, in the Aldanis on the planet of Aldani during season 1, it was the juxtaposition. You wanted a human element, a simple people on a planet that are having the celestial experience, intercut, parallel cut AB with the heist. And so there's lots of metallic sounds. There's a spaceship flying out. There's, gunshots and fights. And so you just want to have the elements combine. It sort of builds along together. And then for the Gorman scenes, or especially for the chant and the singing on Gorman, it was a continuous setup. You'd have the people protesting and then chanting, and then when the singing starts, it was there to embellish. One of the actors kicked it off and sung, and had the production track, which worked really well. And then you see other people around him with the lips moving, but not separately mic'd. So we filled that in. We recorded a bed on set with the entire production. So our production mixer did a wonderful job and gave me multiple microphones that we later on, I had to sync it all up, but I placed it in different, under different reverbs onto the different locations of the plaza. And that was really effective, it would just keep going. But, it's more about really having them all in one rhythm. So once you combine the tracks and you add the loop group, you got to focus on that. So it was a little mechanical to get the chants to work. But there, the purpose was that chant carried the scene. It wasn't, cutting back and forth. We were always on it, and to make it interesting, always being on.
Was that something just for the series? There are so many chants and a lot of that human element that helps build the tension. So was that something intentional, or was that kind of an arc by arc, like, we should do another chant? Or
I think it was very intentional. It was always in the screenplay, so that's where it started, and I think that it was conceptualized that way. Do I usually have a 10-minute long chant? Where very rarely you do. And so it was a new challenge of keeping that going and weaving it in and out of the tapestry and keeping it interesting. And
I guess just on a macro level, you had mentioned Star Wars magic. What is it like to work on Star Wars? Because it's just so cool. Like what is it like just to realize that, oh, this is Star Wars?
it's wild. I mean, you tap into a very long history and the storyline, or so many different storylines. So it can be intimidating too. At first you come to it and you're thinking, okay, what do I need to know and how does this work? But at the same token, Star Wars sonically is known for being very gritty. And so you want to go with that, but you also see it in the image. And so, there's a few guidelines to follow or sounds that had been established, or K2SO's voice in episode in season 2 had already been established in Rogue One. So we used the same treatment, of course. So you got to be aware of these things. Where Admiral Raddus, of course, he had to be the same voice as the one in Rogue One. And so you got to pay attention to all these things, yeah. But it's great fun. I mean, it's a total honor to be part of it.
I want to piggyback on that because it's an interesting question, right? Star Wars has approaching 50 years, right? A wide history and iconic landscape of sounds, and I think it might be an intimidating proposition to come into this show and kind of default, right, to like the library of sounds that's Lucasfilm has created across the decades.
Yeah,
so like, what I think my question for you is when is it important, or how do you approach that in terms of restraint? Because you don't want to just rely on the cliches of some of the sounds that we think we should be hearing in a particular scene. Like, when is it important to kind of reject that tradition and embrace innovating in terms of sound?
Yeah. So you don't want it to be gimmicky. Yes, there's an existing library, and Ben Bird and Matt Wood had designed this for, as long as Star Wars has been around. And they've done an incredible job, and all the sound designers that have worked on it. And so there's libraries of things. But you want to leave your own stamp. So you don't want to just recycle something. You got to stay true to the element that's been introduced to the public on, like the spaceships and all. But at the same token, you want to embellish it. It's a joy to play with it.
One of my favorite moments, the Frankenstein-like birth of K2SO. Yeah. And the marriage of the sound and the visual, as the lightning, as the electricity is powering through him. When does that go to you guys? At what point in the level are you in the process? Are you seeing what's going on with the visual effects and adding the sound? It was just such a perfect marriage of effects and sound.
We get it very early on. So in the first cuts, which worked on each season for about a year, where you work in blocks of 3 episodes, but you take a look at all of them. You'll get notes out of order for whatever the picture editors and Tony are working on. And so I've seen it originally, before visual effects were finished. And you wait until you have something a little more concrete. And so once the visual effects come in, even though they might not be final, you start designing for it. And in that particular scene, the sound design carried the moment, because it made a very tense moment also fun. And you didn't know what to expect, and you were afraid, and you thought, oh, this could really go wrong. And then it was very mechanical and comical. And then his first few lines and the delivery, and then like, okay, a big sigh of relief, this could have gone the other way. And but it was great fun. It's such a good moment. Yeah, so good.
Did you ever consider having Alan record lines for before he was reprogrammed versus after?
In this scenario, Alan's lines were perfect, so we didn't need to do anything in addition. We followed the script on this one. And, the only thing I matched was the processing that had been established in Rogue One. So you want to obviously have continuity. And then in his case, he did just such a wonderful performance. So obviously that was it. There was nothing to change on it. And recording-wise, it was recorded really well. And we could isolate, the dialogue from all the other sounds around it and treated that. And that's the final version. So almost untouched.
Yeah, he's an amazing voice artist. Yeah, it's done so many roles.
Yeah.
Iconic.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to work with.
Do you have a favorite, like, droid or alien character, like a human voice that needs to be touched up, whether it's Raddus or Tubes or...
Well, I'm not impartial here. I really love B2.
Yeah.
So, and there was the story build with B2, it was the puppeteer, David Chapman, is the actual voice that we kept, with a hint of processing, obviously, on it, a little futz. And there was auditions for different voices in post-production, and, can we improve upon it? But Tony always said, B2 is basically the family dog. And the puppeteer did such an amazing vocal performance on top of running his little thing. And I had him in ADR for a couple additional lines where we added things or embellished things. And, just hear him talk about doing the actual performance of moving the robot and then having his voice perform so well on top that it was in the final. Oh, good for him. He totally deserves the credit.
Did he always have the stutter? Was that his idea?
Yeah. So I don't know who came up with the stutter, but we always had the stutter.
That's I remember being like seeing episode 1 and hearing that
Yeah.
Cassie, and I was just like, Jesus, sorry.
So cute. You really believe that family dog thing, and why would you touch that? When you have a moment this great, don't ruin it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about season 2 is how it starts connecting in terms of, it does work in both directions, right? Then connecting to Andor season 1, then connecting to Rogue One. And Andor season 1 seemed like there was a lot of freedom, right? To start creating things that kind of live in its own galaxy, so to speak. But season 2 now needs to kind of start shifting gears into Rogue One. So what was that process in terms of, did anything change, right, between how you worked on season 1 to season 2 in terms of tying both together as you approach Rogue One, or was it a very similar process or on the problem season 1?
You got to tie into it a little bit. So there was a conscientious choice by Tony to keep this very, very realistic still. So these are all real people that are finding their journey towards Rogue One. And you'll notice the same theme, with the droids and all that and the spaceships, but you also notice it with the music. As we're, getting towards the end of season 2, it sort of now gives you and enters the Star Wars world that we're accustomed to. But it was a conscientious choice to pick the audience up in the prequel before on the journey to becoming all the, the characters in Rogue One on that mission.
Awesome. I think we have time for the final wrap-up question. If anybody has something.
I have a question about Sweet Amos.
Yes. Thank you.
Is there any scene outside of Andor in Star Wars that you think could benefit from adding Niamos to it? Going forward, hope so.
It'll be the new intergalactic dance.
Yeah, I always think of just how scenes from the original trilogy would benefit from just having that playing in the background.
Every time Lobot walks by,
So, Kate, that's what he's been listening to this whole time. We're gonna know. Amazing. Thank you all so much for your questions, and thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. The wonderful questions. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that. I know we did. That was Molly and me, along with Goose from Triad of the Force, Jason from Blast Points, and Alex from Children of the Watch, so check all of them out, and look for a second interview Margit did with our friends from Talking Bay 94, Sky Talkers, and Friends of the Force. I'll link to them in the description as soon as they're out. And subscribe to our channel here to catch more interviews we did with Tony Gilroy, Alan Tudyk, and Michael Wilkinson, which are all out or on the way. If you haven't already, please like this video, follow us on our socials, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.